Art therapy really is a sophisticated form of psychotherapy where we use images to bypass language, but in fact we get to the core, because in a way art therapy kind of reaches the parts other therapies don't reach. In verbal psychotherapy, the relationship's a dyad between the psychotherapist and the client. In art therapy, it's a triad. So we have the client, the art therapist, and the image. So all the time we're working through the image. It's about the client's individual process in making the work, and it's also about the relationship that the client will have with the art therapist and how that might be enacted through the image making. Because the client is supported in not having to make a beautiful end product, a product that needs to hang on a wall or is going to be judged, means that the client can really explore a series of paintings in black if they choose, or a series of paintings that are torn and cut and destroyed if they choose, because the art therapy process is without any kind of critical judgment of what the art piece looks like, which is enormously liberating for people. It's very liberating for a client to know that the art therapist will sit with them and the image can show destruction, distress, fragmentation. The client doesn't need to put it into words, and they know that the art therapist understands that the image reflects something of their inner world that they can't yet put into words. Then in the process, what happens is the therapist works with the client and says, let's develop a language, let's think about it, let's give it a context. We use a lot of symbolism and metaphor in our work. So, for example, if I was going to do theme-directed work, and there's non-theme-directed work as well, and I was working with a client about transition, I might suggest that they make an image of a bridge representing a change from one place to the next. And then we could think about, what does the bridge look like? What's underneath the bridge? What's over the bridge? What's on the side of the bridge, etc. Sometimes working with a client, they will be describing a difficulty. Maybe they need to say something important to a parent or a partner, and they might use the word, I just feel I've got a block, or I've got a wall. It's like a brick wall in front of me. Or they might describe going into the tunnel, that it just feels awful. They're in the tunnel of a trauma. So then we would suggest, well, why don't we see what the tunnel looks like? Or draw the wall, or draw the block. Art making is a creative process, but it can also be a destructive process. In order to make a collage, one needs to tear paper in order to stick it down. And sometimes some of the client work is about deconstructing a story or destroying something in order to make something. We might hold two positions simultaneously. Often I speak to clients about the notion of coexisting opposing truths, that two things can simultaneously be true, and the art making can allow that to happen. We can actually put that ambivalence or that opposition into one image or two images or multiple images. And then one can actually start to work with the client and say, well, there's the part of you that is like this and the part of you that is like that. That both these truths can be held, even though that they contradict each other. Now that's quite a hard notion, but in a way, one of the aims of psychotherapy is to learn to live with the ambivalence, to take responsibility for one's unconscious behaviour. Now all these kind of quite big kind of ideas, that could be quite lofty ideals, can be mapped in an image. And when it's down on paper or symbolised through sculpture, or the client can see something of themselves outside of themselves. It's more powerful than a mirror, but it is a type of mirror. Sometimes we don't have language to describe things. We have no words. We might feel overwhelmed, or we might feel fragmented. Art therapists have developed a language to describe these things. I've developed a language because I've seen all these images and I notice fragmentation, or I might notice overwhelm or confusion. But actually what the client might be feeling is just restriction in the throat. They can't breathe, they can't focus. They feel that they distracted all the time, but it hasn't been named yet. There isn't necessarily the emotional literacy that goes along with experience. So art therapy processes help develop emotional literacy to support the experience, and a visual literacy. Where there's been upset, damage, distress, illness, bereavement, shock, people can lose their confidence. There can be a psychic kind of fragmentation that goes on, where there's been kind of psychosis or a psychotic breakdown, schizophrenia. We've got the whole world of people with learning difficulties that might not have a verbal language to articulate, but have a very rich creative language and able to communicate a great deal. Actually, I also think it's really good for the people who are verbally very eloquent, because when one has very good at language, one can hide behind words, one can filter. And during the art therapy process, one can't really hide behind a skill unless one is an artist. So another myth in art therapy is that it's great for artists. Actually, I think artists are the hardest people to work with, though the prerequisite would be that you have an interest in the creative process of making art. And for others, it might be an orientation that's music therapy might be more indicated, or dance movement therapy, or drama therapy. Art might not be the primary kind of creative modality that suits the client. So while somebody is working in the art therapy paradigm and is making art, they are generally working in silence. There's no music or distractions going on. They're in the presence of an art therapist who sits in the space and holds the space with them. And there's invariably an internal dialogue going on while the person is making art. And that dialogue can be anything from, I want it to look like this, or I can't find the right blue, or I don't like the fact that the art therapist is looking at me, to, I remember I must get some milk on the way home. Yeah? So what emerges is the anxiety, the inner critic, the concerns, sometimes the paranoia, sometimes being held. And all this sort of inner dialogue that one even has with one's painting is very much the content of the kind of therapeutic conversation that sort of is followed up, that happens after the image is made. Often as a warm-up exercise, usually as a warm-up exercise, I get people to paint with their non-dominant hand, without a brush or roller or anything. And the idea of working with one's non-dominant hand is that it de-skills the client immediately, so they haven't got the kind of performance anxiety about creating something pretty. They've already got the excuse. And the warm-up exercise gets people engaged in the work, it gets people thinking in a non-linear way, gets one dirty. And these sort of exercises in themselves, it can only last 6 minutes. But I've seen sort of 3 different themes that seem to emerge from this work. There can be the cathart, the vent. There can be the sense of a meditation, something very soothing and very nice to do, and relaxing. And then there can be the kinesthetic, pleasurable, sensuous experience of touching paint. And people will have each of those experiences on different times. It can be different every week. But even the engagement in something that seems so babyish, people will start going, no, I did this in primary school. It has surprising value for people once they're prepared to start. In art therapy, we don't have a lexicon that red means this and black means that, or 5-pointed star is one thing, the 6-pointed star is another. That is one of the big myths about art therapy, that art therapists interpret the image and somehow we know. What is most true, the guideline is what is most true of the image is what the client says of the image. So that in our inquiry, we might say, well, how does that red feel to you? Or what kind of red is that? It could be an angry red, it could be a passionate red, it could be a bloody red, a sexy red, a violent red, etc., etc. So for the client to name it is what is important in the process. Art therapists do not need to be right in understanding the image, and I think that's very important, because through modelling not knowing, through modelling humility in not being right, the client learns a lot. They can interject, they can understand, they can realise that they don't need to be right, and they can sit with the unknown, because the image often is an unknown. We don't always know how to respond to an image. We don't always know what an image means. And sometimes the meaning of an image can come to one later in the week. One can have a dream, or 2 months later something happens. That makes sense. Now I understand. Lisa Silverstone, a person-centered art therapist, a British woman, says an image can sometimes know in advance. When you're ready to know, you will know, and the image will reveal itself to you in time. These sound quite fluffy comments, but I have to say, in 15 years of art therapy practice, I've evidenced it time and time again. I know that to be true.